Good morning again. This is New London, the city where I've served since 1995. There's a lot of ways to describe it. I already mentioned that we had a college president from Connecticut College some years ago that said that her vision was for New London to become a hip little city. And I sometimes ask, are we hip yet? Our city's never lacked for people from out of town who are willing to come here and help us reinvent ourselves. But we've struggled to find people who love us as we are, and we've been this way for a long time. I want you to learn a little bit about the history, about our ministry together. I love serving in New London because I so enjoy history. Just a little bit upriver from here. It's not necessarily upstream. The river changes direction with the tides. But upriver is Baptist Rocks, where our founding pastor, J.B. Swan, used to come and do baptisms year-round. And sometimes that meant that the deacons were supposed to bring big 12-foot poles that they used to push the ice flows out of the way so that Reverend Swan could immerse people, 12 and 14 at a time. That was called Baptist Rocks because that's where so many of the baptisms took place. Eventually, the Baptists, who were definitely on the outside looking in, they've never been an influential people here. They built a little shelter from the wind and the cold, and the locals called it the Hog House. That was their nickname for where the Baptists did the baptizing. If we have the location right, it is also very near Amistad Pier. You're familiar with the story of the Amistad. It was a slave ship that was captured by the Mende tribesmen that were on board, and they brought it to New London, and that's where the Supreme Court battle began. That eventually saw them recognized as human beings rather than cargo. It's also the city that was burned under Benedict Arnold. You probably know Benedict Arnold as a traitor. You may not know that this is the city that he burned. Connecticut's also home of Mark Twain, another good Missouri boy that had the good sense to come and relocate in Connecticut. He retired in Hartford, and he actually wrote a short story about this very place. I'm near Fort Trumbull. That's where I was in the first video. He wrote a short story located around the time of the Civil War in Fort Trumbull. It's not that short. I didn't actually finish the story. It's a little hard to digest. As Twain got older, his stories became darker and more cynical, and a lot of people think that the Civil War had a lot to do with that. It's kind of an occupational hazard. Also nearby is the location of what was called the Little Pink House, New London versus Kilo versus New London. Suzette Kilo, whose house was taken by eminent domain. Miss Kilo lost, but it changed the landscape of our law, and it changed the way people look at how we empower government. I want to talk to you about what it means to be near a river. Very often, if you're near a river, especially where it meets the ocean, you are near history. Israel was taken into captivity by an ancient superpower, and they were by a river. Babylon was by the Euphrates. All the superpowers have had to be by rivers over history. Egypt was by the Nile. Rome was by the Tiber. London by the Thames. They mispronounce it over there because they can't speak American. It's the Thames River. We all know that. New York on the Hudson. And in Psalm chapter 137, which I really ought to have open if I was going to read it, but I don't. Give me a moment here. I'm using the Bible that I bought in college, and that was during the BFF era, that is to say before bifocals. But let me see what I can do with it. Psalm 137 is called an imprecatory psalm. It's when we pray the things we maybe ought not pray. Psalm 137 says, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps. For there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill." May God add a blessing to the reading of His Word. We eat it too. Taste and see that the Lord is good. You know, you really need to pay attention when you feel like hanging up your harp. It says in verse 3 that Israel was being mocked. They were being made fun of by the people who had defeated them and taken them into slavery. When I first came to Connecticut, I served in Simsbury, Connecticut, a wealthy suburb northwest of Hartford. One of the other pastors there was a priest at the Roman Catholic parish. Before he came there, he'd been a chaplain at Yale, and in those days I attended the clergy meetings. I no longer do. There was a Presbyterian pastor, and for discussion he had brought a papal encyclical from Pope John Paul. And Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." And one of the discussions the philosophers and theologians were having back in the late 80s and 90s was on the very concept of truth. Can truth be known? Does truth exist? Is there such thing as moral objective truth? Got a little kitty cat down here. Looks like a black cat. I hope that's a good thing. Does truth exist? And the Pope's letter was saying that if there's no truth, then there can be no freedom. Because Jesus himself said that you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. So yes, truth exists, and truth can be known. And I said at the meeting, that even our liberty as a nation and our Declaration of Independence began with the declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And at that, the priest, for whom I have a nickname I won't share, he guffawed and he said, yes, and then they owned slaves and they massacred the Native American tribes. And of course the whole room full of clergy erupted in laughter, and I don't think they were laughing with me. They were laughing at me. And one of my besetting sins is pride, and I just, even more than normal people, I hate to be laughed at. And I prayed. I remember thinking, Lord, why have you brought me to a place where clergy mock the very idea of truth? I knew that people did. I didn't know I was in a place where so many clergy did. And in hindsight, I had many questions. It's one of those discussions I wish I could go back to and come up with a response, but I just froze. I never had anything like that happen. In hindsight, I can ask, are those truths not self-evident? Are we not endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights? And in owning those slaves and in massacring those tribes, were they wrong? Was that wrong? Well, anybody ought to know that. Well, then if you say anybody ought to know that, you're saying it is a self-evident truth. So we're right back where we started. And by the way, when does a Baptist defend a papal encyclical to a priest? When does a Southern Baptist defend a papal encyclical to a priest? If you don't believe that, what are you doing behind the pulpit? Take off your collar and sell life insurance. But mockery, the power of mockery is what Israel suffered. We live in a culture that gives a whole lot of undue influence to mockery. We think that an insult is an argument. We look to the people with admiration who can fire off a killer tweet and dunk on their opponents. We say things like, you better put some ice on that burn. An insult is not an argument. Just because you've made fun doesn't mean you made sense. So be careful when you feel like it's time to hang your harp on a tree. Psalm 137 is an imprecatory psalm. It's the kind of psalm that you read and go, man, that guy was mad. And you wonder what kind of prayer it is. Well, they're a reminder that there's no wrong way to be honest with God. And by the way, Psalm 137 is very musically influential. There have been a lot of pieces of music written based on Psalm 137. If you're looking for some really depressing songs, and I know you got up this morning hoping the pastor would share some depressing music with you, didn't you? Go Google Psalm 137, or Google better, By the Waters of Babylon. You'll find a lot of things with a lot of pieces where folks have put that psalm to music, including one by Don McLean back in the 70s on his American Pie album. I actually bought that album as a teenager. You'll even see an episode of Mad Men. I don't watch Mad Men. I understand it's not a show to be recommended, but there's a scene on YouTube from Mad Men where they use that psalm, down by the water to pray, or in the water to pray. Interesting thing happened during Israel's exile in Babylon, more than one. But that's where the synagogue came into existence in a very powerful way. In the absence of a temple and isolated in a foreign land and cut off, the synagogue became a cultural and a religious center. Jesus later said that Christians would be cast out of the synagogue. There would have been no synagogues to be cast out of had the exile not happened. The synagogues in what we call the diaspora were the Apostle Paul's first mission field. His church planting strategy, such as you could call it, was to go to the synagogue and get kicked out of the synagogue. There was usually a riot, often an arrest, and he would be horsewhipped. He was horsewhipped at least 3 times. Baptists were arrested in Old Saybrook and brought here to be imprisoned here in New London. And if you go out and go east up the shoreline, it won't be long before you're in Rhode Island, where a Baptist pastor named Obadiah Holmes got in trouble, not because he was in Rhode Island. Rhode Island was a fairly safe place for Baptists, but he crossed the line into Massachusetts, and he led a Bible study in Lynn, Massachusetts, and the congregational authorities there had him horsewhipped. It took him 6 weeks to recover enough to come back to Rhode Island, and his back remained a mass of scars for the rest of his life. The Apostle Paul had a different mission strategy eventually, because God turned him west against his will. God blocked his way. You go read it in Acts chapter 16. He had a vision of a Macedonian man. By that time, his team had fallen apart. On the previous mission trip, John Mark had turned back. You don't turn back when you're with the Apostle Paul. He didn't tolerate that very well at all. And his co-worker and co-ministry partner Barnabas wanted to bring John Mark on that second trip, and Paul would have nothing of it. And the dispute became so powerful that they had to part ways. And so on the second trip, he was going to go back with his new partner Silas and visit the churches that they had already began. And yet God got in his way and said, "No, I'm turning you a different direction." And eventually he saw the vision of the Macedonian man, and he went to a place called Philippi. And at Philippi it says they went down to the river, believing they would find there a place of prayer, and they were not disappointed. As a matter of fact, I'll read that passage now from Acts chapter 16. Acts chapter 16 is my favorite passage of the Bible. I don't have a favorite verse. A lot of people do. I do have a favorite passage. Acts chapter 16, it says, on the Sabbath, beginning in verse 13, on the Sabbath we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women. You'll remember that Paul's vision was specifically of a male. We began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth from the city of Thyatira, who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. If you consider me a believer in the Lord, she said, come and stay at my house. And she persuaded us. Well, it wasn't long after that where things continued along their usual progression for the Apostle Paul. There was a riot. He was arrested. He was placed in the stocks. But God moved in a mighty and miraculous way to set him and Silas free, because they praised him even from the captivity. And so, one of the questions that we have to ask is, what are you doing down by your river? Are you ready to hang up your harp? To me, that seems like a waste of a perfectly good harp. But I understand the sentiment. And I know that these circumstances sometimes bring us to feel that way. Another thing that you can ask yourself is, am I going to grieve or am I going to pray? Those things are not necessarily mutually exclusive, by the way. We're allowed to grieve in prayer. That's what the psalmist was doing in Psalm 137. But in time, he came again to proclaim the glory of the Lord. What are you going to do? Are you going to grieve, or are you going to gather? We're gathering to the extent we can. We're doing live casts in small groups from the church. When we can, we're taking precautions. We're staying 6 feet apart. We're using a lot of hand sanitizer and those sorts of things. This particular Sunday, I wasn't feeling well the past 2 days, and out of an abundance of caution, we didn't meet at church today. But we will again soon. Oh, there's one other feature about this Fort Trumbull area that I wish I could show you if the weather were better. This is a commercial fishing pier. Just around the corner, there's a free fishing pier. What do? Why do we come here? Well, I came here to pray, but we also come here to fish. I'm going to play a song that Facebook may block. They do this sometimes if they hear copyrighted music in the background at a wedding. But I hope that you'll get at least a few seconds of it. If not, I'll put a link up. And just in case they do, I'll first sing a little song that I happened to learn in prison where I serve as chaplain. Somebody prayed for me, had me on their mind, took the time to pray for me. I'm so glad they prayed. I'm so glad they prayed. I'm so glad they prayed for me.